When Sarah Mitchell defended a lone Hell's Angel from two aggressive police officers in her struggling diner, she had no idea that her single act of courage would bring 200 bikers roaring into her small town the very next day, changing everything she thought she knew about judgment, loyalty, and the true meaning of family. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, let's begin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Pine Ridge's Main Street as Sarah wiped down the same coffee-stained counter for the fourth time. The faded yellow paint on Rosie's diner was peeling worse than ever, and the neon sign flickered with the stubbornness of something refusing to die. She glanced at the empty booths, each one a reminder of better times when this place buzzed with laughter and conversation. Her mother's diner had once been the heartbeat of Pine Ridge, a place where factory workers grabbed breakfast before dawn shifts, where teenagers shared milkshakes after school dances, where the whole town gathered to celebrate victories and mourn losses. Now, with the textile mill closed and half the storefronts boarded up, Rosie's diner felt like a museum of memories no one wanted to visit. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she counted the meager bills in the register. $18.37. The electric bill sitting in her purse demanded $243, stamped with red letters that seemed to mock her efforts. Her mother's medical bills from the nursing home added another crushing weight to her shoulders, each invoice a reminder that time was running out in more ways than one. The bell above the door chimed, that familiar sound that had once brought hope, but now only brought anxiety. Sarah looked up, expecting to see Mrs. Chun with her usual order of black coffee and a blueberry muffin, but instead froze at the sight that filled her doorway. He was massive, easily 6'4", with shoulders that seemed to span the entire entrance. Weathered leather jacket, thick gray beard streaked with white, and arms covered in intricate tattoos that told stories Sarah couldn't begin to decipher. But it was the patch on his back that made every other customer in the diner stiffen with fear. The grinning skull surrounded by flames, the unmistakable insignia of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. The few customers scattered throughout the diner suddenly found their coffee cups fascinating. Old Pete, who'd been coming here for 20 years, shifted uncomfortably in his corner booth. Jenny, the young waitress Sarah had hired last month, practically pressed herself against the wall behind the counter. The tension in the room was so thick Sarah could almost taste it, metallic and sharp like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Sarah's mind raced. She knew what this meant for her business. Pine Ridge was the kind of small town where rumors spread faster than wildfire, where being associated with the wrong crowd could destroy a reputation built over decades. Her mother had worked 30 years to make Rosie's Diner a respectable establishment, a place where families felt safe bringing their children, where church groups held their meetings, where the town council gathered for their monthly discussions. One wrong move now, one moment of poor judgment, and everything her mother had built would crumble. Sarah would lose not just the diner, but her last connection to her mother, her only source of income, and any hope of paying for the care that kept her mother comfortable in her final months. The nursing home had already called twice this week about overdue payments. But as the biker approached the counter, moving with surprising gentleness for someone so imposing, Sarah noticed something that made her hesitate. His eyes, pale blue and rimmed with exhaustion, held a sadness so profound it seemed to pull at something deep in her chest. His hands, large and scarred, shook slightly as he removed his leather gloves. A hospital bracelet peeked out from beneath his jacket sleeve. "Coffee," he said quietly, his voice rough as gravel but carrying an unexpected politeness. "Just black. Whatever you have ready." Sarah found herself moving automatically, reaching for the pot that had been brewing since dawn. As she poured, she caught sight of something that made her breath hitch. Tucked into the clear plastic sleeve of his wallet was a photograph of a young girl, maybe 7 years old, with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. The same pale blue eyes as the man standing before her. "Long ride?" Sarah asked softly, sliding the cup across the counter. The biker's massive shoulders sagged slightly. "Been riding since midnight," he admitted. "My daughter. She's at Pine Ridge General. The doctor said." His voice cracked, the words seeming to stick in his throat like broken glass. Sarah's heart clenched. Pine Ridge General Hospital was where her mother had been treated before the stroke, where Sarah had spent countless nights holding her hand and praying for miracles that never came. She knew that particular brand of helplessness, that desperate feeling of watching someone you love slip away while you stood powerless to stop it. "The breakfast special is pretty good," she offered quietly. "Scrambled eggs, bacon, toast. Made fresh this morning." The biker looked up at her with something like surprise, as if kindness was the last thing he'd expected to find in this small-town diner. "That would be, thank you." The bell above the door chimed again, but this time the sound carried a different energy entirely. Sarah didn't need to turn around to know who had entered. She could feel the change in atmosphere. The way the air itself seemed to grow heavier and more charged. Officer Tony Rodriguez and his partner, Deputy Blake Stevens, strode into the diner with a kind of swagger that came from years of unchallenged authority in a small town. Tony had been 3 years ahead of Sarah in high school, the kind of guy who'd been popular enough to think the world owed him something, but smart enough to realize a badge might be the only way to get it. Well, Tony announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like we got ourselves some interesting company this morning." The biker didn't look up from his coffee, but Sarah saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. His hands, which had been steady enough to hold the cup, now showed the slightest tremor. Blake positioned himself near the door, one hand resting casually on his service weapon. The message was clear. Sarah felt her stomach twist into knots as she recognized the setup for what it was. These weren't officers responding to a complaint. This was harassment, pure and simple. "You know," Tony continued, his voice carrying the particular tone cops used when they wanted everyone to know who was in charge, "we don't get many visitors from your organization in Pine Ridge. Especially not the kind with records." "I haven't done anything," the biker said quietly, still not looking up. "Just trying to eat breakfast." Tony laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, I bet you are. Question is, what else are you trying to do? This is a family town. We take care of our own here." Sarah's hands clenched in a fist behind the counter. She'd seen this before, the way Tony used his badge to intimidate anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of acceptable. Last year, it had been the teenagers who dressed in black, accused of being devil worshippers for listening to heavy metal. The year before that, it was the Hispanic family who'd opened a grocery store, suddenly finding themselves pulled over for routine checks every week until they finally gave up and moved away. The biker finally looked up, meeting Tony's gaze with quiet dignity. "My daughter is in the hospital. Stage for leukemia. I'm not here to cause trouble." Blake snorted from his position by the door. "Right. And I'm sure all those weapons you're carrying are just for show." "I'm not carrying any weapons," the biker replied calmly. "Sure you're not," Tony said, stepping closer. "How about you stand up and let us make sure. Hands where we can see them." Sarah watched the scene unfold with growing horror. The biker was complying, moving slowly and carefully, but she could see the humiliation burning in his eyes. Old Pete and the other customers were staring now, some with fear, others with the kind of ugly satisfaction that came from watching someone else get torn down. "Empty your pockets," Blake ordered. "All of them." The biker began pulling items from his jacket. Wallet, keys, a small, worn teddy bear that looked like it had been loved by small hands for years, a bottle of prescription medication, hospital parking receipts, a folded piece of paper that looked like a child's drawing. Tony picked up the medication bottle, reading the label with exaggerated interest. "Pain pills," he announced to the room. "Funny how bikers always seem to have pain pills." "They're prescribed," the biker said quietly. "After my accident last year." "Uh-huh." Tony pocketed the bottle. "We'll need to verify that. Can't have people dealing drugs in our town." Sarah's blood began to boil. Those pills were legally prescribed, and Tony had no right to confiscate them. But more than that, she could see what this was really about. It wasn't about drugs or safety or protecting the town. It was about power. It was about putting someone in their place simply because they looked different, because they belonged to a group that Tony had decided didn't deserve basic human dignity. "That medication is legally prescribed," Sarah heard herself saying. "You can't just take it." Tony turned toward her with raised eyebrows, as if noticing her for the first time. "Excuse me." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but she forced herself to step out from behind the counter. "I said that medication is legally prescribed. If you want to verify it, call the doctor whose name is on the bottle." But you can't just confiscate someone's medication without cause. The diner fell completely silent. Even the old clock on the wall seemed to tick more quietly. Tony's face was flushing red, the way it always did when someone challenged his authority. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a warning, "you might want to think carefully about whose side you're taking here." "I'm not taking sides," Sarah replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I'm just saying that everyone deserves to be treated fairly. He's done nothing wrong." Blake stepped forward, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and let us do our job." "Your job is to protect and serve," Sarah shot back, "not to harass someone who's visiting his sick daughter." The biker looked at Sarah with something approaching wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe someone was standing up for him. "Miss, you don't need to." "Yes, I do," Sarah interrupted, "because this is wrong. And if we don't stand up when something's wrong, then we're part of the problem." Tony's face was now a dangerous shade of red. "Sarah Mitchell, you are interfering with a police investigation. If you don't back down right now, I will arrest you for obstruction." Sarah felt the moment crystallize around her. She could back down, apologize, let Tony continue his harassment, and hope he'd remember her cooperation the next time she needed the police. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. Her mother had always taught her to avoid conflict, to keep her head down and mind her own business. But looking at the biker's face, seeing the quiet dignity with which he endured this humiliation, remembering the photograph of his sick daughter tucked in his wallet, Sarah realized that some things were more important than safety. "Then arrest me," she said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged gun. Tony stared at Sarah as if she'd grown a second head, clearly not expecting such defiance from someone he'd known since high school. Blake's hand was now resting fully on his weapon, though he looked uncertain about what exactly he was supposed to be threatening. "You're making a big mistake, Sarah," Tony said, his voice low and dangerous. "This town has a long memory. People don't forget when someone chooses criminals over cops. And people don't forget when cops abuse their power," Sarah replied. "Give him back his medication. Let him finish his breakfast. Or arrest me and explain to everyone in town why you felt the need to harass a grieving father." For a moment, it seemed like Tony might actually do it. His hand moved toward the handcuffs on his belt, and Sarah felt her knees go weak with fear. But then old Pete's voice cut through the tension from his corner booth. "She's right, you know." Everyone turned to stare at the elderly man, who was calmly sipping his coffee as if commenting on the weather. Pete had lived in Pine Ridge for 70 years, had served in Vietnam, had been married to the same woman for 50 years before she passed. When Pete talked, people listened. "Man's got a sick kid," Pete continued. "Least we can do is let him drink his coffee in peace." Jenny, the young waitress who'd been cowering behind the counter, suddenly found her voice. "My little sister had leukemia," she said quietly. "I remember what it was like. The fear, the hospitals, the way people looked at us like we were contagious." She looked directly at the biker. "I'm sorry you're going through that." Tony looked around the diner, perhaps realizing for the first time that his show of force wasn't playing to a friendly audience. The other customers were no longer avoiding eye contact. They were watching him, evaluating him, and finding him wanting. "This isn't over," Tony muttered, tossing the medication bottle back onto the counter with more force than necessary. "Blake, let's go. We've got real criminals to catch." The two officers stormed out, the bell above the door clanging angrily as it swung shut behind them. The diner remained silent for a long moment, the tension slowly bleeding out of the room like air from a punctured tire. The biker carefully gathered his possessions, his hands still shaking slightly. When he reached for his wallet to pay, Sarah shook her head. "Breakfast is on the house," she said firmly. "Ma'am, I can't let you." "Yes, you can." Sarah managed a small smile. "My mother always said this place was about more than just food. It was about treating people like family. And family doesn't charge family." The biker's eyes filled with tears he was clearly trying to hold back. "Name's David," he said quietly. "David Thompson. My daughter. Her name is Emma. She's 7 years old. I'm Sarah Mitchell. This was my mother's place." Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee with hands that were finally beginning to steady. "How is Emma doing?" David's face crumpled slightly. "The doctors are trying a new treatment. Experimental. It's our last shot." He pulled out his wallet and showed Sarah the photograph she'd glimpsed earlier. A little girl with pigtails and a radiant smile, holding what looked like a stuffed dinosaur. "She's the strongest person I know. Stronger than me." "She's beautiful," Sarah said softly. "And brave, like her father." David looked at her in surprise. "Brave? Ma'am, I was ready to let those cops walk all over me. You're the one who stood up." "Sometimes bravery looks different," Sarah replied. "Sometimes it's about enduring what you can't change, so you can be there for the people who need you." David finished his coffee and stood to leave, but paused at the counter. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing me as a person instead of just a patch on a jacket." After he left, Sarah stood alone in the diner, the weight of what she'd done beginning to settle on her shoulders. She'd made an enemy of Tony Rodriguez, who wasn't likely to forget or forgive. She'd taken a stand that would be all over town by dinner time, dividing people into camps and forcing them to choose sides. But as she looked around the diner, at old Pete giving her approving nod, at Jenny wiping down tables with newfound purpose, at the other customers who seemed to sit a little straighter in their chairs, Sarah realized something had shifted. Something important. The rest of the day passed in a strange blur. Word of the morning's confrontation spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire, just as Sarah had known it would. Some customers stayed away, muttering about Sarah's poor judgment and the dangerous precedent she'd set. But others came specifically because of what they'd heard, curious to see the woman who'd stood up to Tony Rodriguez, wanting to show their support or at least get the real story. By evening, Sarah was exhausted but oddly exhilarated. She'd made probably the biggest mistake of her life, alienated half the town, and quite possibly signed her own financial death warrant. But for the first time in months, she felt like herself again, like the daughter of the woman who'd taught her that standing up for what's right was more important than standing up for what's easy. As she locked up the diner that night, Sarah noticed something new taped to the inside of the window. A child's drawing, obviously done with crayons, showing two stick figures standing next to what might have been a motorcycle. At the bottom, in careful block letters, someone had written, "Thank you for helping my daddy." Sarah smiled, carefully removing the drawing and tucking it into her purse. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new consequences for her actions. But tonight, she had Emma Thompson's artwork and the knowledge that she'd done the right thing. She had no idea that tomorrow would bring something she never could have imagined. Sarah arrived at the diner before dawn, as she always did, but something felt different about this particular morning. The air seemed to hum with an energy she couldn't quite identify, like the atmosphere before a summer storm. She went through her usual routine, brewing coffee, prepping the grill, checking supplies, but found herself glancing repeatedly toward the windows facing the street. At precisely 8 o'clock, she heard it, a low rumble in the distance, so faint at first that she thought it might be thunder. But the rumble grew stronger, deeper, more rhythmic. It was the sound of engines. Many engines. Sarah stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron, and felt her breath catch in her throat. From both ends of Main Street, motorcycles were appearing. Not just one or two, but dozens, then more dozens. They came in formation, riding 2 by 2, their chrome gleaming in the morning sunlight, their engines creating a symphony of power and purpose. She recognized the patches immediately. Hell's Angels. Different chapters, different states, but all bearing the same proud insignia that David had worn the day before. They filled the street in front of Rosie's diner, parking with military precision, their riders dismounting with practiced synchronization. Sarah stood frozen, watching as easily 200 bikers gathered in front of her small diner. They were a diverse group, men and women, young and old, but all carrying themselves with the same quiet dignity she'd seen in David. And as they approached the diner, Sarah realized they weren't here to cause trouble. They were here to say thank you. The first to enter was a woman in her 60s, silver-haired and leather-clad, with eyes that held both kindness and steel. Behind her came David, looking rested for the first time since Sarah had met him, a genuine smile on his weathered face. "Ma'am," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Patricia Williams, president of the Northern California chapter. David told us what you did yesterday." Sarah shook Patricia's hand, still too stunned to speak. The diner was filling rapidly, bikers taking seats wherever they could find them, others standing along the walls with respectful patience. But there was no menace here, no threat. These were people who understood respect, who recognized kindness when they saw it. We wanted to do something to show our appreciation, Patricia continued. Not just for David, but for what you represent. There aren't many people left in the world who are willing to stand up for strangers. David stepped forward, and Sarah could see that his eyes were bright with emotion. Emma's responding to the treatment, he said quietly. The doctors say it's too early to be sure, but her white blood cell count is improving. She wanted me to give you this. He handed Sarah a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a bracelet made of colorful beads, the kind a 7-year-old might make during art therapy in a hospital. Attached was a note in crayon. For the nice lady who helped my daddy. Love, Emma. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she fastened the bracelet around her wrist. It's beautiful, she whispered. She wants to meet you when she gets out of the hospital, David added. If that's okay. I'd love that, Sarah replied, and meant it completely. Patricia clapped her hands once, getting the attention of the entire diner. Now, she announced, we're hungry, and we've heard this place serves the best breakfast in 3 states. What do you say we prove it? What followed was organized chaos of the most wonderful kind. Orders flew across the room as Sarah and Jenny worked frantically to keep up with demand. Other bikers, without being asked, stepped behind the counter to help, taking orders, flipping pancakes, pouring coffee with the efficiency of people accustomed to working as a team. The phone in the kitchen rang incessantly as food suppliers took emergency orders for eggs, bacon, bread, and coffee. Patricia had quietly taken care of payment arrangements, ensuring that Sarah wouldn't be out of pocket for feeding her small army of guests. But more than the food, more than the money, was the atmosphere they created. These were people who understood loyalty, who valued respect, who knew the difference between looking dangerous and being dangerous. They treated Sarah's diner like a sacred space, careful with the furniture, polite to other customers, generous with tips that would keep the lights on for months. Word spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire, but this time the gossip carried a different tone. Curiosity rather than fear, wonder rather than judgment. People began gathering on the sidewalks across the street, watching the spectacle of 200 Hells Angels having breakfast at Rosie's Diner. Some locals, braver than others, ventured inside. Mrs. Chun, the elderly Chinese woman who ran the flower shop, found herself in animated conversation with a biker grandmother about different ways to prepare green tea. Tom Brady, who owned the hardware store, discovered that several of the bikers were skilled mechanics who could help him source parts for vintage tools. Even more surprising was the arrival of Father Miguel from St. Patrick's Church. The young priest had heard about the gathering and come to see if his services were needed for conflict resolution. Instead, he found himself sharing a booth with 3 bikers who turned out to be deacons in their own churches back home, discussing theology over eggs and hash browns. As the morning progressed, Sarah began to understand that this wasn't just about thanking her for standing up to Tony Rodriguez. This was about something deeper, something that had been missing from Pine Ridge for too long. It was about community, about looking past surfaces to see the person underneath, about recognizing that respect and dignity weren't earned by conforming to expectations, but by how you treated others when it mattered. The bell above the door chimed again, and Sarah looked up to see a familiar figure entering. Officer Rodriguez stood in the doorway, hand resting on his service weapon, face flushed with anger and what might have been fear. Behind him, Chief of Police Margaret Hayes followed, her expression carefully neutral. The diner fell silent as every head turned toward the 2 officers. Patricia Williams stood slowly from her booth, her movement casual but commanding attention. The other bikers remained seated, but Sarah could feel the shift in energy, the way a peaceful gathering could become something else entirely if pushed too far. Officers, Patricia said politely. Is there a problem? Chief Hayes stepped forward, and Sarah was relieved to see her signal Rodriguez to stay back. Margaret Hayes was old-school law enforcement, the kind who believed in community policing and earned respect rather than demanded it. No problem, Chief Hayes replied. Just want to make sure everything was peaceful here. Peaceful as Sunday morning, Patricia assured her. Just folks having breakfast and making new friends. Chief Hayes surveyed the room, taking in the mixed crowd of bikers and locals, the easy conversations, the obvious lack of tension. Her eyes met Sarah's across the room, and Sarah saw something like approval in the older woman's gaze. Well then, Chief Hayes said finally, I suppose we'll leave you to it. Sarah, If you need anything, don't hesitate to call." As the officers prepared to leave, Patricia called out, "Chief Hayes, we've got plenty of food if you'd like to join us. Coffee's fresh." For a moment, Sarah thought the police chief might actually accept. But Margaret Hayes simply nodded respectfully and ushered Rodriguez toward the door. "Thank you for the invitation," she said. "Perhaps another time." After they left, the diner erupted in conversation and laughter. The tension broken, the gathering took on an even more festive atmosphere. Someone produced a guitar, and soon there were voices raised in harmony, singing everything from Johnny Cash to gospel hymns. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself moving through the crowd like she was hosting the world's most unusual family reunion. Bikers pressed $20 bills into her hands for $5 meals, signed napkins for her to keep as mementos, shared stories of their own encounters with prejudice and their appreciation for people willing to stand against it. One grizzled veteran with tears in his eyes told her about coming home from Vietnam to protesters calling him a baby killer, and how a diner waitress in Nebraska had refused to let him pay for his meal, saying simply that everyone deserved kindness. A woman with intricate tattoos covering her arms talked about losing custody of her children because of her appearance, despite being a loving mother and successful businesswoman. David found Sarah during a quiet moment, pulling her aside with obvious emotion. "You did something yesterday that most people wouldn't do," he said quietly. "You saw past the leather and the patches and the stereotypes. You saw a father worried about his daughter. And because of that, Emma's going to grow up in a world where she knows there are still good people willing to stand up for strangers." "I just did what felt right," Sarah replied. "That's what makes it matter," David said. "Anyone can do the right thing when it's easy or profitable or popular. It takes character to do it when it costs you something." As evening approached, the bikers began preparing to leave. But before they departed, Patricia presented Sarah with a custom leather vest, black and beautifully crafted, with "Friend of the Angels" embroidered across the back in silver thread. Inside the vest was a card signed by every person who had been there that day, a roster of names from across the country, united by respect for a small-town diner owner who had shown them dignity when they needed it most. "This means your family now," Patricia explained. "Anywhere you go, any angel you meet, they'll know you're one of the good ones. That protection extends to this place, too. Anyone gives you trouble because of what you did, they'll answer to all of us." Sarah slipped on the vest, surprised by how right it felt, how the leather seemed to settle around her shoulders like an embrace. She looked around the diner, now empty except for David, Patricia, and a few stragglers helping with cleanup. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Say you'll keep being you," Patricia replied. "The world needs more people like you, Sarah Mitchell. People who judge by character instead of appearance. People who stand up when it matters." After the last motorcycle disappeared into the distance, Sarah stood alone in her diner, surrounded by evidence of the most extraordinary day of her life. The register was full for the first time in months. The tip jar overflowed with bills and coins and notes of gratitude. But more than the money, more than the temporary financial relief, was the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The next morning brought a steady stream of customers. Some came out of curiosity about the previous day's events, others because they'd heard the food was good, still others because they wanted to show support for what Sarah had done. The phone rang constantly with reservations and interview requests from newspapers as far away as San Francisco. Tony Rodriguez never returned to the diner, but Chief Hayes became a regular, often stopping by for coffee and pie while discussing community policing strategies with Sarah, who had apparently become something of an informal advisor on building bridges between different groups. Emma Thompson was released from the hospital 3 weeks later, her leukemia in remission. Her first stop, at her insistence, was Rosie's Diner, where she presented Sarah with a hand-drawn picture of the two of them standing together under a rainbow. The little girl, bald from chemotherapy but radiant with life, insisted on helping Sarah make pancakes, standing on a step stool and carefully flipping them while her father watched with tears of joy. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the diner. About the day, 200 bikers came to thank a waitress for showing kindness to one of their own. The story was picked up by regional papers, then national ones. Television crews arrived, wanting to interview Sarah about tolerance and community and standing up for what's right. Through it all, Sarah remained focused on what mattered most: serving good food with genuine kindness, treating every customer with dignity regardless of how they looked or where they came from, and maintaining the values her mother had instilled in her about what it meant to run a place that served the community. The vest Patricia had given her hung proudly behind the counter, next to her mother's old apron and a photo of Emma Thompson smiling in her hospital bed. They were symbols of different things: tradition and innovation, past and future, family and chosen family. But they all represented the same core truth: that how we treat each other, especially when we're different, defines who we are as human beings. 6 months later, Rosie's Diner was thriving again. The breakfast rush required 2 additional waitresses. The lunch crowd often spilled onto the sidewalk, and dinner reservations were booked weeks in advance. Sarah had been able to move her mother to a better facility, closer to town, where she could visit every day. The electric bills were paid on time, the roof was repaired, and the neon sign glowed bright and steady through the night. But more than the financial success was the transformation of Pine Ridge itself. The story of the diner had brought the community together in unexpected ways. The town council organized diversity workshops. Local churches began hosting interfaith dialogue sessions. The high school started a peer mediation program to address bullying and prejudice. Emma Thompson, now cancer-free and sporting a head of curly blonde hair, had become something of a celebrity in Pine Ridge. She visited the diner every weekend with her father, always ordering chocolate chip pancakes and regaling other customers with stories of her hospital adventures and her plans to become a doctor when she grew up. On the 1-year anniversary of that life-changing day, 200 motorcycles once again lined Main Street in front of Rosie's Diner. But this time, they were joined by local residents, church groups, school children, and even Chief Hayes and several of her officers. The gathering had become an annual celebration, officially declared Kindness Day by the Pine Ridge City Council. Patricia Williams, now in her 70s but still commanding respect wherever she rode, stood before the crowd that filled the diner and spilled onto the street. "A year ago," she announced, "one woman showed us that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet voice that says, 'This is wrong,' when everyone else stays silent. Sometimes it's the person who chooses compassion over comfort, understanding over judgment." She turned to Sarah, who stood behind the counter wearing both her mother's old apron and the leather vest the angels had given her. Sarah Mitchell reminded us that we're all just people trying to make it through another day, trying to take care of the ones we love, trying to find a little kindness in a world that can sometimes feel pretty cold. She reminded us that how we treat each other matters, that our actions ripple out in ways we can't always see, that sometimes the smallest gesture can change everything. The crowd erupted in applause, but Sarah barely heard it. She was looking at Emma Thompson, now 8 years old and healthy and vibrant, sitting at the counter coloring in a book while her father David watched with the contentment of a man who had been given back his most precious gift. She was looking at old Pete, now 91, and still holding court in his corner booth, regaling anyone who would listen with stories of the day the bikers came to town. She was looking at Jenny, who had been promoted to assistant manager and was training 2 new waitresses in the art of treating every customer like family. Most of all, she was looking at her mother, now seated in a wheelchair by the window, able to visit the diner for the first time since her stroke. Rose Mitchell's speech was still limited, her mobility compromised, but her eyes were bright with pride as she watched her daughter receive recognition for embodying the values she had spent 30 years instilling. As the celebration continued around her, Sarah stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The street that had once seemed like a symbol of Pine Ridge's decline was now bustling with life and activity. New businesses were opening, young families were moving back, and the sense of community that had been lost was slowly being rebuilt. She thought about that morning a year ago when she'd made the decision to stand up for David Thompson. At the time, it had seemed like the most natural thing in the world, hardly worth thinking about. She'd simply seen a person in pain and chosen compassion over caution, kindness over conformity. But standing here now, surrounded by the evidence of how far that single moment of courage had rippled outward, Sarah understood something her mother had tried to teach her years ago. We are all connected in ways we can't always see, and our actions matter more than we know. One moment of kindness can change a life. One act of courage can transform a community. One person willing to stand up for what's right can inspire others to do the same. The bell above the diner door chimed, and Sarah turned to see Emma Thompson skipping toward her, chocolate chip pancake syrup still sticky on her chin, her father's eyes twinkling with the joy of a man who had learned not to take any moment for granted. "Miss Sarah," Emma announced importantly, "Daddy says you're a hero. Are you really a hero?" Sarah knelt down to Emma's eye level, thinking about how to answer. She could talk about standing up to bullies, about showing kindness to strangers, about doing the right thing even when it's difficult. But looking into this little girl's face, seeing the future bright and full of possibilities, Sarah realized the answer was much simpler. "I think we're all heroes, Emma," she said softly. "Every time we choose to be kind instead of cruel. Every time we help someone who needs it. Every time we stand up for what's right even when we're scared. You're a hero too, you know. You fought cancer and won. You make people smile just by being yourself. That's pretty heroic to me." Emma beamed, her gap-toothed grin lighting up her entire face. "When I grow up, I'm gonna be a doctor hero and help sick kids like me." "I know you will," Sarah said, meaning it completely. "And I'll be right here cheering you on." David approached, his leather jacket creaking softly as he knelt beside his daughter. "Time to head home, sweetheart. You've got school tomorrow." Emma hugged Sarah tightly, her small arms surprisingly strong. "Thank you for saving my daddy," she whispered into Sarah's ear. "And thank you for the pancakes." As father and daughter walked toward David's motorcycle, now equipped with a special sidecar decorated with Emma's artwork, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. This was what her mother had meant when she'd said the diner was about more than food. It was about creating a place where people could be themselves, where kindness was the currency that mattered most, where everyone was welcome at the table. The crowd began to disperse as evening settled over Pine Ridge, but the energy of the day lingered like the warmth from a well-tended fire. Patricia Williams approached Sarah one last time before departing, her weathered hands clasping Sarah's with genuine affection. "You know," Patricia said, "when we first heard David's story, we came here planning to make a statement. Show the town that Hell's Angels don't forget loyalty. Don't let disrespect go unanswered. We were thinking about power, about making sure people knew not to mess with our family." She paused, looking around at the mixed crowd of bikers and locals, children and grandparents, all united by the simple act of sharing a meal together. "But what we found was something much more important," Patricia continued. "We found that real strength isn't about intimidation or fear. It's about building bridges, creating understanding, showing the world that beneath all our differences, we're just people trying to take care of each other. You taught us that, Sarah. You showed us what real courage looks like." As the last motorcycle disappeared into the purple twilight, Sarah stood with her mother outside Rosie's diner, watching the neon sign flicker on for another night. The letters glowed steady and bright now, no longer struggling against the darkness, but standing as a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed too quick to judge, too eager to divide, too willing to choose fear over understanding. "Proud of you, sweetheart," Rose Mitchell managed to whisper, her words slightly slurred but filled with unmistakable love and pride. Sarah squeezed her mother's hand gently. "I learned from the best, Mom. Everything I did, everything I am, I learned right here in this diner watching you treat every person who walked through that door like they mattered." That night, after the dishes were washed and the chairs stacked and the last customer had headed home with a full belly and a lighter heart, Sarah sat alone in the diner with a cup of coffee and Emma Thompson's latest artwork. The drawing showed Rosie's diner surrounded by motorcycles and cars, with stick figures of every size and color holding hands in a circle around the building. At the top, in Emma's careful 8-year-old handwriting, were the words "where everyone belongs." Sarah taped the drawing to the window where everyone could see it, right next to the original "Thank you for helping my daddy" picture that had started it all. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose kindness over comfort, new chances to prove that one person really could make a difference. But tonight, sitting in her mother's diner surrounded by the evidence of what was possible when people chose to see the best in each other, Sarah Mitchell felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt hope, not just for herself, not just for her business, but for the world itself. Because if a small-town waitress and a grieving biker and his cancer-surviving daughter could teach an entire community about the power of compassion, if 200 Hell's Angels could join hands with church ladies and police officers and school children in celebration of simple human kindness, if one moment of courage could ripple outward to transform hearts and minds and lives, then maybe, just maybe, there was reason to believe that better days were coming. Maybe the world wasn't as broken as it sometimes seemed. Maybe there were still enough people willing to stand up for what was right, still enough hearts open to change, still enough love to overcome the fear and hatred that seemed to dominate the headlines. Sarah finished her coffee, turned off the lights, and locked the door of Rosie's diner. Tomorrow she would be back, ready to serve breakfast to anyone who walked through that door, ready to prove once again that kindness was never wasted, that dignity was everyone's birthright, that sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply treating each other like human beings. As she walked to her car under a canopy of stars, Sarah could still hear the echo of laughter and conversation, still feel the warmth of Emma's hug, still see the tears of gratitude in David's eyes. These were the moments that mattered, the memories that would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. The bell above the diner door caught the wind and chimed once, soft and clear in the night air, like a promise whispered to the darkness. Tomorrow there will be coffee. Tomorrow there will be kindness. Tomorrow there will be hope. And in a world that often seemed short on all three, that was enough to change everything. Years passed, and the story of Sarah Mitchell and Rosie's Diner became legend in Pine Ridge and beyond. Emma Thompson graduated high school as valedictorian, earned a full scholarship to medical school, and kept her promise to become a doctor. She specialized in pediatric oncology, carrying forward the compassion that had saved her father's spirit during her darkest days. David Thompson eventually retired from his job as a motorcycle mechanic to become the diner's head of security and community outreach, helping other businesses in Pine Ridge learn how to build bridges across cultural divides. His gentle strength and hard-earned wisdom made him a natural mediator, and his story became required reading in the Police Academy's courses on community relations. Patricia Williams, now in her 80s, still led the annual Kindness Day ride, though she traded her Harley for a comfortable touring bike with better back support. She often spoke at conferences about leadership and loyalty, always beginning her talks with the story of a small-town waitress who had changed everything with a single act of courage. Rose Mitchell lived to see her 91st birthday, spending her final years in a chair by the diner window, greeting customers with a smile that transcended the limitations of her stroke-damaged speech. When she passed peacefully in her sleep, the funeral procession included 200 motorcycles, their riders serving as honor guard for a woman who had taught her daughter that everyone deserved dignity and respect. Sarah never married, finding her fulfillment in the family she'd created at the diner, in the community she'd helped heal, in the lives she'd touched through simple acts of everyday kindness. She wrote a book about her experiences called What I Learned from Angels, donating all proceeds to childhood cancer research. The book became a bestseller, inspiring similar stories of courage and compassion from around the world. But perhaps the most important legacy was the one that couldn't be measured in books sold or awards won or speeches given. It was the legacy of changed hearts and open minds, of a community that had learned to look beyond surface differences to see the humanity beneath, of children who grew up believing that kindness was strength and that standing up for others was the highest calling. Every morning, as Sarah unlocked the door of Rosie's Diner and turned on the lights for another day of service, she remembered that moment when she'd chosen courage over comfort, compassion over safety. She remembered David's trembling hands around that coffee cup, Emma's crayon drawing, Patricia's leather vest, her mother's proud smile. And she understood, with the clarity that comes only from living a life guided by love rather than fear, that every single day offered new opportunities to be the kind of person the world needed. Every interaction was a chance to choose kindness. Every moment was a possibility for transformation. The bell above the door chimed as the first customer of the day entered, and Sarah looked up with a genuine smile, ready to begin again the quiet revolution of treating every person who walked through that door like they mattered, like they belonged, like they were family. Because that's what heroes do. Not with capes or superpowers, but with coffee and pancakes and the radical belief that everyone deserves to be seen, to be heard, to be valued for who they are rather than what they appear to be. One cup of coffee at a time, one moment of kindness at a time, one act of courage at a time. until the whole world transforms. This story shows us that heroism isn't about dramatic gestures or superhuman abilities. It's about the quiet courage to do what's right when it matters most, the strength to show compassion when others show judgment, and the wisdom to understand that how we treat each other defines who we truly are. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the power we all possess to make a difference in someone else's life, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the extraordinary potential within ordinary moments. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness is never wasted, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the smallest acts of love can change everything. Because in a world that often feels divided, we all have the power to be bridge builders, to be the ones who choose understanding over judgment, compassion over indifference, love over fear. We all have the opportunity to be someone else's hero, just by being willing to see them as human. What will your next moment of courage look like? See you in the next video.